The harsh, artificial glare of 1,000 camera flashes bounced off the ancient marble of the Palazzo Chigi, creating a strobe effect that made the scene feel more like a fever dream than a press conference. Giorgia Meloni stood at the center of this electric storm, her expression unreadable, a mask of enigmatic calm that had, for the past several months, driven the high-ranking bureaucrats in Brussels to the very precipice of professional madness. To the casual observer, she was simply Italy's first female prime minister preparing to deliver yet another routine address on European cooperation. But to those who had studied her every move since 2022, there was something different in the air. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with the scent of an impending political earthquake. At 47 years old, after a career defined by calculated silences and the kind of intricate diplomatic chess that would have made Machiavelli blush, Meloni was finally ready. She was prepared to voice a truth that had been festering in the dark corners of the Parliament building, a truth that everyone in the corridors of power suspected but no one, until this moment, had dared to whisper into a live microphone. What she was about to say was not designed for the morning headlines. It was calculated to rip open the darkest secrets of the European Union and permanently alter the trajectory of the continent's history. To truly grasp why this specific moment felt so explosive, one must ignore the polished stateswoman of the present and look back to the beginning of her ascent. There was a time, not so long ago, when a younger, fiercer Giorgia Meloni stormed the opposition podiums of the Italian parliament like a marauding force of nature. In those days, she didn't just criticize the European Union, she declared a total, uncompromising war upon it. She famously called it a supranational monster, a cold, mechanical heart designed to devour national sovereignty bite by bite until nothing was left of the unique cultures of the Mediterranean or the North. She was the fiery, screeching voice of the populace, a woman screaming in the wilderness against what she termed the tyranny of unelected elites. Her rhetoric was a jagged blade, cutting through the polite consensus of the Rome establishment. Yet, the very second she walked into the corridors of real executive power in 2022, a shift occurred that was so immediate and so baffling that it left the political world paralyzed. The woman who once described the EU as a bureaucratic prison was suddenly seen shaking hands with Ursula von der Leyen, smiling from meticulously staged photo ops, and playing the role of the perfect, diligent diplomatic student. The transformation was so total that critics immediately screamed betrayal, claiming she had been bought by the very system she promised to dismantle. Her supporters, desperate to maintain their faith, nervously labeled it pragmatism. But they were all missing the larger, more terrifying picture of what was actually happening behind those heavy, soundproof doors in Brussels. The reality of Meloni's discovery only began to crystallize much later, when the perfect storm finally made landfall. She hadn't been tamed by the system, she was infiltrating it. While the elites in the European Commission thought they had successfully assimilated the populist threat through a mixture of financial incentives and social pressure, Meloni was allegedly executing a masterstroke of intelligence gathering. Under a mask of total compliance, she was documenting the rot from within, piece by piece. The first hairline fracture in the carefully constructed facade of European unity didn't appear in Rome, but in the courtrooms of Paris. It was March 31, 2025, when a French court delivered a verdict that sent a seismic shockwave through the bedrock of European politics. Marine Le Pen, a woman who had spent decades as a thorn in the side of the French establishment, was found guilty of embezzling European Union funds. The punishment was swift, draconian, and politically lethal. She was stripped of her right to hold public office for 5 years. To the casual observer, it was a simple matter of legal justice. But to Giorgia Meloni, watching silently from the Palazzo Chigi, it was a political execution disguised as a court order. For Meloni, this verdict wasn't about misappropriated funds or administrative errors. It was a symbol, a flare gun fired into a midnight sky. It fit perfectly into a terrifying pattern she had been observing for months, a pattern of institutional weaponization. When the news of Le Pen's disqualification reached Rome, something inside Meloni finally snapped. For the first time since taking her oath of office, the mask of diplomatic politeness slipped, and the world caught a glimpse of the fire underneath. Her public statement following the verdict was carefully calibrated, yet underneath the layer of diplomatic jargon, it pulsated with explosive insinuations. She spoke of democracy under siege, of a system that criminalized dissent, and of millions of voters being silenced by judicial fiat. But her words carried a deeper, coded message that European insiders understood immediately. Meloni wasn't just defending a political ally, she was signaling that she knew exactly how the game was rigged. According to sources buried deep within the Italian government, a very different story was unfolding behind the scenes during her compliant years. while she was shaking hands in Brussels and discussing fiscal policy, Meloni was allegedly operating like a quiet assassin. Reports suggest she kept meticulous, detailed records of every closed-door meeting with EU officials. She documented every veiled threat, every whisper of institutional blackmail, and every attempt to strong-arm national governments into submission. She was building a massive evidentiary dossier documenting what she believed to be the European Union's mutation from a voluntary alliance of sovereign nations into an authoritarian superstate obsessed with its own self-preservation at all costs. The evidence, her supporters would later claim, was damning. The migration crisis became the perfect testing ground for this new brand of soft totalitarianism. Italy, standing alone on the front lines of the Mediterranean routes, begged for European solidarity. Rome demanded practical, logistical solutions to a colossal humanitarian emergency. But instead of help, Brussels offered lectures. They preached about humanitarian obligations while refusing to share the actual burden of processing and integration. When Meloni proposed innovative solutions, such as processing centers in Albania, the response from the EU core was one of mockery and bureaucratic sabotage. It became terrifyingly obvious to her that Brussels didn't want a solution, they profited from the chaos. Instability was the currency they used to justify the expansion of their own power and control over national borders. But migration was merely the tip of a much larger iceberg. The green transition, the digital agenda, the demands for unified defense spending, every major initiative rolling out of the Berlin building carried the same unspoken subtext: comply or face the consequences. Meloni watched as they systematically isolated Viktor Orbán in Hungary, weaponizing EU funding to strangle his economy and questioning his democratic mandate at every turn. She saw how they treated Poland when Warsaw dared to assert the supremacy of its national constitution over European directives. The blueprint was unmistakable, and it was chilling. The turning point, the moment that truly radicalized Meloni, can be traced back to Ursula von der Leyen's comments just days before the Italian elections in 2022. The Commission president had warned that if things went in a difficult direction, Brussels had tools to deal with Italy, just as they had with Poland and Hungary. It was a moment of institutional blackmail on a scale never before seen in European history. The message was clear: vote for the right candidate, or we will crush your economy. However, von der Leyen, in her hubris, made a fatal miscalculation. She revealed the true nature of the beast to the one person smart enough to remember it and patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike back. As 2025 unfolded, the EU's shiny veneer began to rot in earnest. The promise of economic recovery evaporated, leaving citizens crushed under inflation and an unprecedented energy crisis. The grand projects of the Green Deal were either scaled back or abandoned in a state of panic. The emperor had no clothes, and the European electorate was beginning to notice. Meloni's positioning during this period was nothing short of a masterclass in political warfare. She played the role of the obedient ally to perfection, all while secretly documenting every abuse of power, every anti-democratic maneuver, and every betrayal of the very values the EU claimed to uphold. She knew her hour was approaching. She knew that eventually, the European Union would overplay its hand so egregiously that even its most ardent defenders would be forced to confront the ugly truth. The conviction of Le Pen was that spark. It lit the fuse on the bomb Meloni had been assembling for 3 years. She was no longer just a politician, she was a witness for the prosecution and the trial of the European Union. The revelation, when it finally arrived, was devastating in its simplicity. Standing before a packed hall in Rome beneath the Italian tricolor, Meloni finally uttered the words that would echo across the continent. She exposed the existence of an alleged secret coordination between Brussels officials and national judiciaries designed to eliminate political rivals through lawfare rather than democratic competition. She laid bare a systematic campaign to delegitimize any leader who dared to question the European project. But the most shocking blow was her personal confession. Meloni declared that her entire transformation from Eurosceptic firebrand to compliant ally had been a carefully orchestrated ruse. Every handshake with von der Leyen, every diplomatic smile, and every compromise was part of a massive intelligence operation to document the corruption from the inside. She played the role of the converted populace to build a case that would bring down the Brussels establishment. She presented what she claimed was irrefutable proof, recordings of Commission officials discussing how to remove inconvenient national leaders and internal memos regarding the weaponization of EU funds based on political loyalty. Ursula von der Leyen's office immediately scrambled into crisis mode, issuing desperate statements about the rule of law and the sanctity of European institutions. But the damage was terminal. Meloni hadn't just called for an exit, she had declared the moral death of the European Union. She argued that the institution was no longer reformable, having morphed into a system designed to punish dissent and protect unelected elites. The battle for democracy, she concluded, would not be won in the European Parliament, but in the national capitals. Giorgia Meloni had entered the belly of the beast and returned with the only weapon capable of destroying it, the truth. Yet, the aftermath of her declaration proved even more explosive than the speech itself. Financial markets trembled as rumors spread of deep fractures within the European Council. Commentators on every major network debated whether this was the beginning of a new nationalist awakening or the most dangerous gamble of Meloni's career. Inside Italy, crowds gathered in city squares, some waving flags in defiant support, others expressing a paralyzing fear of economic retaliation from Brussels. The country felt suspended between the hope of liberation and the terror of uncertainty. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings were convened across European capitals. Diplomats who had once dismissed Meloni as merely theatrical now confronted a far more complex reality. If even a fraction of her alleged evidence proved authentic, the institutional credibility of the Union would suffer irreparable harm. Quietly, a handful of leaders began reassessing their own experiences with Commission pressure, recalling moments when policy disagreements had been met with subtle financial threats or regulatory delays. Doubt, once whispered, was now spoken cautiously aloud in the halls of power from Berlin to Madrid. Meloni, however, did not retreat. She doubled down, calling for a pan-European conference on sovereignty and democratic accountability. She framed her battle not as Italy versus Brussels, but as citizens versus an entrenched, faceless bureaucracy. In interviews, she insisted that cooperation between nations was essential, but only if rooted in mutual respect rather than coercion. Her tone remained firm but measured, as if aware that history was judging every syllable. The European Parliament demanded formal clarification. Investigative committees were proposed. Legal scholars clashed publicly over the interpretation of treaties and the limits of Commission authority. What had begun as a single speech in Rome evolved into a continental reckoning about the future of integration itself. Was the Union destined to centralize further into a United States of Europe, or would it recalibrate toward a looser confederation of sovereign states? As weeks passed, the political temperature refused to cool. Protests erupted not only in Italy but in several member states where Eurosceptic movements seized the momentum generated by Meloni's defiance. At the same time, staunch federalists rallied in defense of the European project, warning that fragmentation would invite economic instability and leave the continent vulnerable to geopolitical rivals. The ideological fault lines that had long existed beneath the surface were now fully exposed, bleeding into the public consciousness. Through it all, Meloni maintained that her objective was reform, not total destruction. She argued that transparency was the ultimate act of loyalty to Europe's founding ideals. Whether history would remember her as a defender of democracy or as the catalyst of unprecedented division remained uncertain. But one fact was undeniable: the silence had been broken. The carefully managed image of seamless unity had cracked, and the debate over power, sovereignty, and accountability was now impossible to contain. In the end, the story was no longer just about one leader or one institution. It was about the fundamental question facing modern Europe: who truly governs, and in whose name? And as that question echoed from Rome to Brussels and beyond, the continent stood at a crossroads, aware that whatever path it chose next would define its destiny for generations to come. In the months that followed, the confrontation evolved from a political dispute into a defining ideological struggle. Editorial boards across Europe framed the crisis as a referendum on the soul of the Union itself. Was integration meant to shield nations from instability, or had it quietly become a mechanism that suppressed national self-determination? Universities hosted emergency panels. Retired judges gave carefully worded interviews. Former commissioners, once invisible to the public, suddenly found themselves dragged into the spotlight and forced to defend decisions made years earlier. Meloni capitalized on the momentum with strategic precision. Rather than launching immediate legislative retaliation, she called for transparency audits within Italy's own ministries, signaling that her campaign against centralized overreach would begin at home. Accountability must be universal, she declared, reinforcing the narrative that her movement was not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but a structural correction of a system that had lost its way. The move disarmed critics who had anticipated impulsive defiance. Instead, they were confronted with a disciplined, methodical deconstruction of the status quo. Meanwhile, tensions inside the European Commission intensified to a breaking point. Some officials pushed for a firm, punitive response to what they described as reckless accusations threatening institutional stability. Others urged restraint, warning that aggressive retaliation would only validate Meloni's claims of coercion and blackmail. The internal divide mirrored the broader fracture spreading across member states. Northern and Eastern European governments quietly expressed sympathy for aspects of her argument, even if they stopped short of public endorsement. Southern states, burdened by economic vulnerability, weighed the risks of alienating Brussels against the rising domestic pressure to assert autonomy. The financial dimension added another layer of volatility. Credit rating agencies issued cautious statements. Investors analyzed treaty clauses and recovery fund disbursement schedules, trying to predict whether economic tools might be deployed as leverage against Rome. The mere speculation fueled public suspicion that political disagreements could translate into fiscal punishment, further damaging the EU's image. Each rumor amplified the sense that Europe was navigating uncharted and dangerous territory. Yet, beyond the strategy and the spectacle, something more profound was unfolding. Ordinary citizens who had rarely engaged with the minutiae of institutional politics began reading treaty summaries and following parliamentary debates. Complex terms like subsidiarity and competence creep entered mainstream conversation. What had once been confined to policy circles was now discussed in cafes, workplaces, and over family dinners. The democratic awakening Meloni had hinted at was materializing in real time. Sensing the historical gravity of the moment, she proposed a continent-wide summit dedicated to redefining the balance between national governments and European bodies. Her proposal emphasized three pillars: transparency in decision-making, clear limits on centralized authority, and enforceable protections for electoral mandates within member states. Whether the summit would ever materialize remained uncertain, but the proposal alone shifted the narrative from confrontation to reconstruction. Brussels responded by accelerating its own communication campaign. Officials highlighted the achievements of collective action, coordinated pandemic recovery, joint energy procurement, and a unified sanctions policy. They argued that solidarity required shared rules and that selective obedience would unravel decades of hard-won progress. The message was clear: unity was not coercion, but a necessity in an era of geopolitical turbulence and rising global rivals. As winter approached, the standoff matured into a stalemate of rhetoric and competing reform proposals. Neither side achieved total dominance, yet neither retreated. The European project, once perceived as an irreversible march toward deeper integration, now appeared subject to fundamental renegotiation. Political analysts began referring to the period as Europe's constitutional crossroads. For Meloni, the personal stakes were immense. Allies praised her as courageous, a modern-day Joan of Arc for national sovereignty. Critics branded her dangerously ambitious, a populist arsonist playing with the fires of economic ruin. But she remained consistent in her tone, emphasizing that sovereignty and cooperation were not mutually exclusive. She insisted that a stronger Europe could only be built on the voluntary confidence of its nations, not on implied threats or bureaucratic inertia. By the end of the year, one undeniable transformation had occurred: the unquestioned aura surrounding European institutions had faded. Scrutiny replaced assumption. Debate replaced deference. Regardless of where the pendulum would ultimately swing, the era of silent acceptance was over. As the lights dimmed on yet another emergency summit in Brussels, observers understood that this was not merely a clash of personalities between a prime minister and a commission president. It was a recalibration of power in real time. Europe was redefining itself through conflict, through dialogue, and through the uncomfortable but necessary confrontation of its own internal contradictions. Whether that process would ultimately fracture the Union beyond repair or fortify it with a new, more transparent foundation remained to be seen. But the course of history had shifted, and there was no returning to the quiet that once concealed the storm. The struggle for the identity of a continent had begun in earnest, and the world was watching Rome for the next move. The narrative of Giorgia Meloni's long game became a foundational myth for a new generation of European leaders. Her tactical retreat in 2022 was now seen as the ultimate preparation for a decisive strike. She had demonstrated that the most effective way to challenge a centralized power was not from the outside, where one could be easily ignored or silenced, but from the very heart of the decision-making process. By the time her dossier was fully leaked to the public, the technical details of the Lawfare coordination were being taught in law schools across the globe. The scandal forced a series of high-level resignations within the Commission, leading to a period of institutional paralysis that some feared would lead to a total collapse. However, in that vacuum of power, the national capitals found a new sense of agency. They began to communicate directly with one another, bypassing the Brussels intermediaries that had for so long dictated the terms of their engagement. This horizontal cooperation became the template for what Meloni called the Europe of Nations. It was a vision where the central body served as a coordinator for trade and defense, rather than a moral or political arbiter. Critics warned that this would lead to a balkanization of the continent, making it impossible to compete with the United States or China. But for the supporters of the new movement, the risk of economic competition was far preferable to the certainty of democratic decay. As the years passed, the Meloni speech was cited as the moment the Great Integration stopped and the Great Recalibration began. The European Union survived, but it was a shadow of its former self, more humble, more transparent, and significantly less powerful. The tools that von der Leyen had once threatened to use were locked away, replaced by a new set of treaties that explicitly limited the Commission's ability to interfere in the internal judicial and electoral processes of member states. The era of the supranational monster had ended, not with a bang of an exit, but with the steady, relentless pressure of a leader who knew that the truth, when timed perfectly, is the most destructive force in politics. The storm had passed, but the landscape it left behind was unrecognizable, a continent finally forced to reconcile its grand ambitions with the simple, enduring reality of national identity. In the end, Giorgia Meloni didn't just change the rules of the game, she reminded the players that the power had always belonged to the people they were supposed to represent.